Welcome, I'm Gary Fries of Catawba College. This is the second half of our ramble through the history of the American Revolution in Rowan. In the first half, we studied a phase of local history called the Regulation. This protest movement greatly upset the residents of our county. They had learned the hard way that the British meant business when they called for us to obey them and pay the taxes they had imposed. When protests throughout the 13 colonies led to war in Massachusetts, local residents soon lived up to the promises made in the Rowan Resolves of 1774, that the cause of Boston was the cause of all Americans. Today, we will look at the very important role that Rowan played in what one local resident said was the terrible struggle for independence. Early in May 1775, word reached Salisbury that British redcoats had been defeated by the Minutemen at the battles of Lexington and Concord. This was actually good news to many Rowan residents. The Scots-Irish in particular had grievances against the English that went back to their old homes in Ireland and Scotland. In Mecklenburg County, on May the 20th, 1775, the Scots-Irish leaders there voted to void the King's commissions. That meant effectively that the British no longer ruled in Charlotte. To this day, North Carolinians call this action the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. It is a date on our state flag. Word of what Charlotte had done was quickly sent to Salisbury, and residents here agreed with most of the ideas. For more than a year, the Committee of Safety, the forerunner of our county commissioners, had been meeting to stockpile arms in case there was a second British invasion. The committee also met to determine everyone's loyalty. If you were for the independence movement, you were known as a Whig. If you remained loyal to the King, you were a Tory. For the rest of the American Revolution, Rowan residents were divided between Whigs and Tories. The first Tory to suffer was John Donne, whose residence was here where St. John's Church is today. John Donne had been one of the first residents of Salisbury and its first lawyer. He's the namesake for Dunn's Mountain. In 1774, he had written to British authorities claiming to still be loyal to the King despite what the Rowan Resolves had said. In May 1775, the young men of Salisbury surrounded his house, took him out of it along with another Tory, and bound them up and took them all the way to Charleston, South Carolina. Donne was in prison for 2 years, then became a patriot and got to return home. By the time the Declaration of Independence was signed on July the 4th, 1776 in Philadelphia, most Rowan residents had declared themselves to be Whigs. Most believed that they would live securely in their homes for the rest of the Revolution. Some actually marched off to fight with the Continental Army under General George Washington. I'm standing in front of the stone house built in granite quarry in 1766. John Brown, a son of Michael Brown, joined the Army and was actually married here July the 11th, just a week after the Declaration was signed. He would fight in the Army for the next 6 years or so. His bride was Catherine Miller, the daughter of Wendell Miller, one of the first Germans to come down the Great Wagon Road. By 1776, Rowan leaders had begun to worry about British allies on their western border. The Cherokee might attack at any time. Griffith Rutherford, the local general who lived to the west of China Grove, led an expedition into the mountains that burned Cherokee towns and scattered its residents. The Cherokee were not a threat to Rowan for the rest of the Revolution. Although the war was being fought up north after 1776, that did not mean there wasn't conflict back in Rowan County. There were two issues still up in the air. The first one was who owned the land. The old Granville district was no longer effective since Lord Granville's family lived in England. In early 1777 and 1778, you could actually get almost as much land as you wanted if you came to the courthouse and had it surveyed. These were known as state grants back then. The second issue was determining who was loyal to the new government. A 1777 law made all North Carolinians swear allegiance to the state. However, the Rowan County Sheriff of the day George Henry Barger, reported that hundreds of residents had failed to take the loyalty oath. Most of those were concentrated in what was then called the Forks of the Yadkin, the area where Davie County is today. The Whigs had a really interesting way to punish the Tories. If you didn't swear loyalty to the new government, you had to pay 4 times the normal tax rate. In addition, if a Tory refused to pay the taxes, he could be arrested and his property could be confiscated. The very first year, more than 500 Rowan citizens refused to pay their taxes, and more than one had their land confiscated. In one case, the leaders of the county actually took iron nails from a Tory's house and used them to repair the courthouse. Sounds like a pretty good deal for the Whigs. A war way up north, land if you know how to find it, and guaranteed political power. Salisbury even became a local supply center for the war effort. One resident supplied more than 1,000 beef cattle to the Army. War, of course, has a way of changing lives rapidly. By 1779, the British had experienced key defeats in the north. They shifted their attention to the south, where they thought that large numbers of Tories would contribute to their cause. The British quickly gained key victories at Savannah and Augusta in Georgia, and in May 1780, they captured the key port of Charleston, South Carolina. Among those lost were the balance of the North Carolina troops, including our own Continental John Brown. North Carolina lay wide open to invasion. After the surrender of Charleston, Rowan citizens grew alarmed at a potential British invasion. When they discovered that more than 1,000 Tories were rallying on the South Fork of the Catawba River, 400 Rowan militia, under the leadership of Colonel Francis Locke, marched across the river and defeated the Tories at the Battle of Ramseur's Mill. It was a costly affair. At the end of an hour's fighting, 7 Rowan captains lay dead on the ground. Among the casualties was also Adam Torrance, who ran the most popular tavern in the county. After the Battle of Ramseur's Mill, 2 military leaders led the resistance in Rowan. Both had been Continental officers during the siege of Charleston, but both had been wounded and left before the city was surrendered. The first officer was William R. Davie, who had come to Salisbury during the war to study law under Judge Spruce McKay. Colonel Davie led a group of mounted troops that continually engaged the British as they invaded the Carolinas. When 1,000 Rowan Tories marched to join the British, Davie defeated them at a battle called Hanging Rock. He also led the defense of Charlotte when the British invaded there and kept them from moving on to Rowan in 1780. The other leader was William L. Davidson. Davidson had grown up near present-day Mooresville and was an original member of the Committee of Safety in 1775. Later, he joined General Washington's army, where he served with distinction. He even survived the horrible winter at Valley Forge. Davidson was made the local general after Griffith Rutherford was captured at the Battle of Camden in 1780. When Over Mountain men defeated the British at the Battle of Kings Mountain in the fall of 1780, Davidson was given time to organize his forces and turn Salisbury into a supply depot for the American Army. The resistance led by Davie and Davidson soon gained international renown. One British officer wrote back to London that the counties of Mecklenburg and Rowan were more hostile to the British than any other in America. Lord Cornwallis, the British commander, soon called the area the Hornet's Nest, and the nickname has stuck ever since. It should be noted that the women of Rowan County did their share to help defend their homes. As the British approached, and here I'm reading from an old account, the young ladies of Mecklenburg and Rowan entered into a pledge not to receive the attentions of young men who would not volunteer in the defense of their country. They claimed, and again I quote, that such men must be destitute of that brave and manly spirit that would qualify them to be the defenders and guardians of the fair sex. Davie and Davidson soon got help from General Washington. He sent his best field commander, General Nathaniel Greene of Rhode Island, to the south to defend North Carolina. Although it was winter and most armies did not march during that season, Greene sent half his troops into western South Carolina to fool the British into thinking he was invading. They gave chase and they were defeated for the third time at the Battle of Cowpens. Lord Cornwallis was so angry at this that he determined to invade North Carolina even though the weather was cold and rainy. His objective was Salisbury. General Greene organized the defense of our area here at the Catawba River. General Davidson placed the Rowan troops on the eastern side right here where the power dam is at Cowan's Ford. Meanwhile, Lord Cornwallis is marching the British Army from the west through knee-deep mud. On an early morning before dawn, the British began to cross the river here at Cowan's Ford. A teenager spied the British in the swollen river and soon sounded the alarm. The American militia fired upon the redcoats as long as they could. It was said later that bodies floated as far as 20 miles downstream. However, the King's Guards, one of the crack units of the British Army, soon gained the eastern bank of the river. The Americans had to retreat. At that moment, a Tory, Frederick Hager, shot General Davidson dead. After the British left the river, looters stripped the body of General Davidson. Neighbors soon came and collected him and brought the body here to Hopewell Presbyterian Church in Mecklenburg County. That night, they buried him by torchlight. Mrs. Davidson crossed British lines 8 miles to be present for the burial. With the death of General Davidson, chaos gripped the area. Rowan soldiers did make one last attempt to stop the British. They gathered here at Torrance Tavern, not too far from the river, and they waited for the British in the rain. Colonel Banister Tarleton, the disgraced British commander from the Battle of Cowpens, soon came riding down the road with his cavalry. He scattered the American militia and killed as many as 50 people. It was, by the way, the only pitched battle fought in Rowan County during the War for Independence. One of the stories told about the battle at Torrance Tavern was that of a woman inside the tavern itself who was accused of shooting a British officer. Her life was in peril, but she quickly pointed out to the British that all the muskets inside the tavern were still loaded. All the men had run away. They let her go. This woman could have been Anne Torrance, who was the proprietor. She would later lose her tavern when the British burned it down the day after the battle. Angry redcoats soon scattered across the neighborhood. They burned 3 houses despite orders not to harm civilians. Lord Cornwallis himself had to rescue Mrs. Moses Winslow, who was trying to retrieve possessions from her burning house. British soldiers were actually tearing them out of her arms and throwing them back into the flames until his lordship ordered them to stop. While the British were in the neighborhood of Torrance Tavern, one Rowan soldier, James Houston, was wounded and could not walk. His family members took him to a nearby swamp and hid him there until the redcoats had gone. After their defeat at Torrance Tavern, Rowan soldiers scattered to the winds. That night, General Greene waited at a rendezvous point near Salisbury, but no one came. General Greene came here to the tavern kept by Elizabeth Maxwell Steele. At the front door was the army physician, who asked him, "How do you find yourself, my good general?" Greene replied, "Wretched beyond measure, without money, without friend, destitute even of a companion." Mrs. Steele soon had General Greene well fed and warmed by the fire. Before he left, she came up to him with 2 bags of gold, part of her life savings. She said to him, "Take these, for you will need them, and I can do without them." General Greene was so heartened by Mrs. Steele's gift that before he left the tavern, he took down from the wall a portrait of King George and wrote on the back, "Old George, hang thy head and mourn." He then replaced the portrait with the face against the wall. Mrs. Steele's sacrifice for liberty has long been remembered in Rowan. Our local chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution is named in her honor. The American general soon joined his army crossing the rain-swollen Yadkin River. The British appeared on the hill over there just as the last American boats were pushing off. Soon, the British were firing cannonballs into the retreating American army. General Greene was in a cabin here on this side of the river, writing dispatches to General Washington. He continued to write even as the cannonballs went through the roof and splinters fell all around him. Cornwallis's army then camped here in Salisbury until the rain stopped. Tradition says that the tents of the British Army covered this entire area of Church Street, all the way from where the public library is today to what we call the English Cemetery. It gets its name because Cornwallis buried more than a dozen of his soldiers who had died from wounds they got at the Catawba River battles. The most notorious British officer was Banister Tarleton, the commander of the Dragoons. He made himself at home at the residence of John Lewis Beard, which was located here where St. Luke's Church is today. Colonel Tarleton terrified one of the Beard children, and the little boy cried the whole time. An exasperated Tarleton ordered a slave to choke the child. Luckily, Mrs. Beard intervened in time. During the occupation, the British supply officer had to provide the best food to Lord Cornwallis. Mrs. Faust, a daughter of John Donne, lived in his old house right here where St. John's Church is. She had a favorite calf who was grazing in the front yard. When the British offered to buy it, she refused. They took it anyway, roasted it for his lordship's supper, and then offered her a gold coin. She refused to take it. One evening, Colonel Tarleton and other British officers were having dinner at the home of Dr. Anthony Noonan, who lived here at the square. During the dinner, Dr. Noonan's sons were in the yard playing a version of Cowboys and Indians that they were calling Redcoats and Whigs. In the midst of their joy, they shouted, "Hurrah for Washington! Tarleton is running!" a reference to Tarleton's recent defeat at the Battle of Cowpens. It was said that Colonel Tarleton held his peace as long as he could, but eventually he put his head out the window and cursed those little patriots. At some point during the occupation, the Brown family here at the stone house heard a horseman approaching. They opened the front door and saw an American officer riding as fast as he could towards them. Before they knew it, the officer had gone through the front door on the horse and burst out the back door and down the steps. The officer eluded the British and ran off into the woods. They never found him. When the British left Salisbury, they marched through Davie County to Old Salem to avoid the high waters of the Yadkin River. Soon after, they fought a major battle with Greene's army at Guilford Courthouse, where they were defeated. Cornwallis then retreated to Wilmington to resupply, and then made a fateful decision to invade Virginia. In October 1781, he was trapped at Yorktown by General Washington's army and a French alliance. Rowan residents were involved in this campaign. Frederick Miller, the son of Wendell Miller, one of the founders of Oregon Church, later said that he marched in the defense of those persons who were friendly to the country. Although the British did not come back to Salisbury, the war lasted another year, and Rowan citizens continued to fight one another. The most notorious Tory of all, David Fanning, led a raid across the Yadkin River into Salisbury. At one point, Captain James Smith, a Whig, was shot to death at his own front door at his home near the trading ford. Reverend Adolph Nussman, the first Lutheran minister in the county, was taken from his home and beaten by the Tories. One of the Whig families also attacked by the Tories lived very near the South Branch of the Rowan Public Library, where I'm sitting. Jethro Rumpel, our first historian, tells the story. While only 7 years old, little Margaret Pfeiffer performed a deed of heroism worthy of memory. Some ruffian Tories and British soldiers visited her home, and with lighted torches ascended the stairs with the purpose of setting the house on fire. Little Margaret fell on her knees and, throwing her arms around the nearest of the invaders, implored him to spare their home. Their hearts were melted by the tender pleading of the child, and they withdrew and left the house standing. By 1782, the British had surrendered at Yorktown and evacuated Charleston. The war, however, was not quite over in Rowan. In March that year, the county court began to convict, one by one, more than 100 Tories. Most had their property confiscated. In the case of one, however, Captain Samuel O'Brien, the leader of the Tory regiment in the Forks of the Yadkin, the verdict was death by hanging. Eventually, Captain Bryan was reprieved. By 1784, most Tories had been pardoned or left the county, and Whigs had begun to rebuild their lives and their fortunes. Rowan residents, however, remained suspicious of anyone or anything which might jeopardize their newly won liberties. In 1788, Rowan delegates to a state convention voted not to ratify the United States Constitution, even though a former resident, William R. Davie, had helped to write it. George Henry Barger joined with others to call for a Bill of Rights to protect American liberties. One of the first congressmen to vote for these amendments was John Steele, who lived here to the north of Salisbury. He was the son of the famous Elizabeth Maxwell Steele. Most Rowan residents could finally believe that the struggle for liberty was over when they could see George Washington with their own eyes. In 1791, the first president of our country made a tour of the southern states, and he passed through Rowan County. He noted in his diary as he left Charlotte that he was coming into a good wheat country, and he noted later after visiting Salisbury that it was a pleasant village. These are the letters which Washington and the citizens here exchanged as a result of this visit. They're here in the Rowan Public Library. One of the most interesting episodes of President Washington's visit occurred before he got to town. He was on his way to Salisbury here on the old Great Wagon Road, and he decided to stop here at the Richard Brandon farm and ask for breakfast. 12-year-old Elizabeth told him that all the grown-ups had gone to Salisbury to see the president. Washington assured her that if he got breakfast, she would see him first, and she did. Rowan residents like Betsy Brandon long remembered the sacrifices associated with the struggle for liberty. We can do the same today when we learn the facts of our heritage and understand that the values of our ancestors are not that far from the ones we hold today as a county and a community.
Thank you for watching a ramble through Rowan's history, The Struggle for Liberty, Part 2. I'm Gretchen Biles-Witt, librarian for the Edith M. Clark History Room of the Rowan Public Library. We would like to extend special thanks to Rowan Museum, the artist Werner Willis, Edward Clement, owner of Lombardy, St. Luke's Episcopal Church, St. John's Lutheran Church, Salisbury, Hopewell Presbyterian Church, the Guilford Courthouse National Military Park and Tannenbaum Historic Park, and Thyatira Presbyterian Church. If you have any ideas for future segments or would like to pursue a partnership to assist with sponsoring of a Ramble Through Rowan's history, please contact me at the Rowan Public Library, 704-216-8232. Thank you.